There are many cases where a room has an obvious focal point. Like you walk into the space and you're like, that is the star of the show. In this chapter, I'm going to help you evaluate and then also identify what is or could be that statement-making moment in your design. We'll do this by finding and then elevating your focal point. I'll even show you how to create a focal point in a room that may or may not even have one using those same fundamental ideas. So let's get started. The very first thing you want to do is assess your room. There are four main things that you have to stick with. First of all, the geography of the room. Which direction does it face? What kind of sunlight does it get? And that leads me into lighting. Is it like a lot of sunlight? Is it indirect sunlight? Is it like none at all? And then also there's architecture, meaning like what style of architecture is your house? What type of architectural inspiration do you have to draw from? And then there's the mood. Is it a formal space? Is it a laid back space? Is it a creative space? Is it a space you use during the night, during the morning? When you answer all these questions in your own room, the room itself can tell you what the focal point is supposed to be. The best way to explain what a focal point is it's the area in a room that you intentionally want to be the star. It's either something architectural or something that has to do with color or pattern or a light source where you walk into the room and it's the first place you want your eye to go and it's what you want all the furnishings to take their direction from. I can show you what I mean by breaking down my own living room. That's the room that I'm in right now. First of all, geographically speaking, this is an east-facing room, which means the morning light in here is incredible. And it stays really well lit until like the late afternoon, and then once the sun goes over the house, this room is a little bit more flat. So the light in here is great when I want to do work in here during the daytime or actually relax while the sun is still out. Then there's the architecture. I live in a mid-century modern house. Mid-century modern architecture takes place between 1933 and 1965. A lot of the overall style is from what's called the Bauhaus movement, and my house takes its mid-century modernism very seriously. And the vibe and the mood are also both really important. This mood in here is supposed to be super relaxed. There's nothing formal about this space. This isn't a place where I actually sit down and need to know which fork to use when I'm eating dinner. It's more like a place where friends can come over, take off their shoes, and have long conversations. So those things are all like super represented right here in this space. There are many cases where a room has an obvious focal point. Like you walk into the space and you're like, that is the star of the show. There are other times when you walk into a room and you're like, there's absolutely nothing special here and nothing to draw inspiration from. And in that case, that's where you can actually make your own focal point. And I will show you how to do that in another room. In here, the focal point is obviously this window wall. But the way it was when I first bought the house was instead of one beautiful, big, black steel, industrial factory window, it was a bunch of smaller angular windows with a lot of trim. And my eyes went to like thick blocks of trim rather than the beautiful scene outside the glass. So I knew what I needed to do was like modify it so it would be all about the trees and not about all the trim, because it made the focal point like impossible to miss from any direction in the room. So not all focal point situations require a huge remodel and a bunch of expense. However, when you are focusing on really making a focal point and investing, staying power is like everything. When I say staying power, I mean like, what's the shelf life on this? Like, is this something that's gonna be just as awesome 25 years from now as it is today? So whatever you're gonna do to enhance your focal point, you wanna make sure it's something that's gonna stand the test of time. Once you've determined what your focal point is, then it's all about figuring out how to elevate it, especially if it needs elevating. That means creating a design plan that doesn't go against it, but actually enhances it or works with it. The next step is really where interior decorating and interior design comes into really work lockstep with a focal point. And that's using the furnishings to enhance the focal point. The first piece of furniture that I chose from the room, well, pieces, happen to be these low loungers. They're really, really low slung. They don't have any pattern. They're neutral. And they're so low to the ground that they enhance the height of the focal point. One of the biggest advantages to these loungers is the fact that they don't have a solid back, so they don't at all block the view when you're outside looking in. And because mid-century modern architecture is all about bridging the gap between the indoors and the outdoors, they were like the perfect fit. Funny story, interior design is all about learning and growing and getting better. I was so focused on choosing furniture in here that was really low to accentuate the focal point. I forgot that I am 6'5". So these were so low to the ground before that they were giving me back problems, and I ended up at the chiropractor like twice a week. So I had my contractor make these 7-inch tall bases, which raise it up just enough, still does not block the view, but at least my back feels better. Another thing that I did in this room was choose very few furnishings. There's not a lot of stuff. In fact, the upholstery on the loungers is the same exact shade of grayish as the woven rug. It's this whole tone-on-tone design situation. That was on purpose. If there's gonna be anything in the room that's really dark and dramatic, it should be the steel window. So I walked you through a room which was designed around a focal point that tells you what it is. But what I wanna show you next is a room where we had to actually create a focal point. So my home office could not be more different from my living room, like polar opposites. When I bought this house, this was a guest bedroom, and there was nothing about it that was really memorable at all. It was like a beige room. The closet layout was way different. We had like mirrored doors, and that's it. There was like nothing about it that was interesting. There was no focal point. Even though these two rooms are like totally different, in order to create the focal point in here, I followed those same 4 principles: geography, light, architecture, and mood. The room itself is southeast facing, and it's right where the top of the trees sit. So there's all this tree canopy that causes this area to be super dark. So that was the reason the overall light source in here looks a little bit dark. And that's also why I had to create my own mid-century modern architecture. We did that with the ceiling. I also did it with new doors that are stained in dark walnut with this really beautiful atomic style 1950s hardware. And as far as the mood is concerned, I wanted the vibe to be preppy, moody, mid-century, and also kind of collegiate at the same time. All right, so if you're in a similar situation, you have just like a square or rectangular box that doesn't actually have a focal point, then it's like zeroing in on what would be the best. Is it the walls? Is it the ceiling? Is it your floor? Is it a window? Is it doors? Is it hardware? And the answer is yes, it could be any of those, but it should probably just be one of them because you don't want things to fight. No actual focal point in here. There was no interesting moment to start with. So I had to decide, what is it gonna be and how am I gonna make it? And I thought the walls had the most surface space to add personality. So wallpaper is the focal point here. Then it comes down to, how do I enhance it and not detract from it? I did bring in some architecture. I had to kind of force the room to have some architecture, and that's with the ceiling. I added this very modern look to the ceiling using the stained slats of wood, and then I painted the area above them black so it looks like a shadowed effect. So instead of running away from the fact that the room is dark and moody, I embraced it and brought architectural accents in that were dark, and they actually make the wallpaper look brighter, so that was a win. If you ensure that the room has some sort of interior architecture that's in check with the era and the style of your house, it won't argue with your new focal point, it'll just make it look like it belongs there. It kind of eases it into the house and makes it look like it was there from the beginning of the house's existence. Another thing that's really interesting in here is because the pattern on the walls is so bold, everything else in here is just textural or woven or very tactile, but the only actual pattern is on the walls. One of the most underappreciated things in the design world is a term known as planes. And planes are things that you have to add to a room because they just need to exist. They don't need to be the star, they don't have to be the biggest expense, they don't have to be the biggest decorative item, but they help finish a room without detracting from your focal point. And in here, the planes are things like the white leather upholstery that doesn't really have much detail to it. Also, the flat painted MDF trim in here, there's no profile to it, it's not fancy, it kind of fades away. The doors, no ornamentation whatsoever, they're just a very simple, solid slab of birch that are stained dark walnut, which was a really popular stain in the 1960s. So all of these things combined, they just like do their job and exist, but they don't compete at all with the pattern or the color of the wallpaper. So in this chapter, I've taught you how to assess a room to find out how to identify the room's focal point or how to create one if you don't necessarily have one. I've also showed you how to elevate a focal point and then also design or furnish a space around it. And this all comes from years of experience trying things, failing, succeeding, somewhere in between, and learning how all this works in all different types of architecture. So thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time.